Okay, so the first part of youth subcultures and youth culture is the theoretical views, and they're mainly focusing on on youth as a period of time that's not contributing to deviance in society. So, if anything, it's contributing to consensus or social stability, social order. And their acts might be deviant, but only temporarily, and that actually eases the transition into a more stable society later on. And obviously, the different perspectives have different views on whether that's a positive thing for society or whether it's only positive for certain groups, for example, the bourgeoisie. And the key thing to focus on as well here is whether the question's asking about youth culture or youth subcultures. So, the idea of youth culture is talking about young people experiencing the time period in a fairly homogenous way. So, experiencing it in a similar way, having the same kind of norms and values, same sorts of experiences. It's not really differentiated by class, gender, ethnicity, etc. Whereas if they're talking about subcultures, it's the idea that young boys and girls or different genders or different ethnic groups, classes would experience it in a different way based on those key characteristics. So functionalists are talking about youth culture because they're not making distinctions based on class, gender, and ethnicity in this case here. So Parsons is talking about the period of transition, so similarly to education, where he's talking about education being the bridge between the family and the workplace. It's the same idea. The period of adolescence is the transition from childhood to adulthood, and it allows young people to learn the norms and values of society, and that is positive because it helps increase social cohesion in the future because there is a shared understanding of how to behave. Eisenstadt, second functionalist, is talking about young people using their teenage years as a time to rebel temporarily, and then that allows them to kind of blow off steam and adjust to the adult world where they have to conform. So it's kind of like a measured period of rebellion, and then it allows them to settle down in the future and then prevents anomie once they're in adulthood because they've kind of already got that period of rebellion out of their system. Roszak talks about the generation gap, and he argues this plays a positive role because it reduces social divisions in society that are based on class, gender, and ethnicity. So he argues that youth culture is an inevitable natural difference there's a natural difference between the different age groups. So he's arguing that if we have a separate culture for young people, then that unites all young people together, regardless of their different social characteristics. And the main difference and distinction between groups is to do with their age. So there's a natural order based on age, and that replaces any other social divisions. So it means that we have a more cohesive and equal society because racism, sexism, etc. don't exist. This is what he's saying, due to the main focus being between age groups, and then within the same age group there's a sense of social solidarity and unity. So youth culture plays a positive role because the generation gap replaces all other social divisions, and it helps unite people and overcome other differences that may exist. Evaluation. So Marxists argue that it all ignores class differences and how different social class groups would experience it differently and break off into subcultures. Hockey and James argue that it treats young people in a homogenous way, and argues that they all have the same norms and values and conform to those. And then Cloudinol in the idea that it might not just be a temporary period of transition, that this could end up being a lifelong sort of membership to certain subcultures. Marxist views, so they are obviously focusing specifically on subcultures because they're not looking at youth as a homogenous whole group. They're looking at how the working class experience adolescence differently. So Hall and Jefferson are arguing that the bourgeoisie impose their values on the rest of society, and that's called hegemony. And this leaves young people angry at the system and wanting to rebel against capitalism and reject those norms and values because they disagree with them. And young people use their subcultures to resist the system. So they don't have kind of legitimate or meaningful ways of protesting. So they use their fashion and their music to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with the leadership of the country. And he argues that youth is the kind of main time when people can do this, because once they've got the responsibilities of a job and being professional, having to pay a mortgage, that kind of thing, obviously not able to do things that could be perceived as deviant, that could get them into trouble with their jobs. It means that young people are the only group that can do this. They get it out of their system when they're young, and then when they're older, they get locked into the capitalist system and have to sort of conform and obey to the bourgeoisie. So he's arguing that by getting it out of their system when they're young, they then conform when they're older. So it's very similar to what Eisenstadt is saying, but obviously Eisenstadt's saying that it benefits the whole of society because it creates this sense of stability, social stability, social order, whereas Hull and Jefferson are saying that it only benefits the bourgeoisie, and capitalism. Hebditch is talking about the role of youth subcultures actually benefits capitalism and it makes profit for them. So often youth subcultures use fashion to rebel, and they create certain symbols that demonstrate how they're kind of anti-establishment, that sort of thing. So you can use an example of like the acid house smiley face, or the Che Guevara t-shirt that's everywhere, Sex Pistols t-shirts, that kind of thing, or their music. And then the argument is what started out as a symbol of rebellion against the bourgeoisie actually makes profit for them because it becomes incorporated into mass culture and it's kind of marketed as part of mass culture, and therefore they make all the money from those sales. So the purpose is to benefit the bourgeoisie. Lastly, Brake is saying that youth subcultures don't actually have any political significance or power, but they allow young people to feel that they are resisting against the system. So it's kind of, the bourgeoisie have so much power that they are allowing people to form these subcultures, to feel that they're doing something, to feel that they're attempting to make a change, because they're so confident in the fact that there won't be anything significant that will happen to challenge their power. So subcultures such as the skinheads can exist, and that sort of benefits the bourgeoisie as people feel like they're doing something to change their situation, but actually there's so little impact that it benefits capitalism because it feeds into that false class consciousness. It feeds into them feeling like they do have a sense of democracy or a sense of a voice in society, but actually they don't really have any power at all. Evaluation, Eisenstadt, they're only adjusting to the norms and values. It's not related to the bourgeoisie. It's positive for all members of society. Cohen, this idea of researcher bias. We don't necessarily know that people were wearing those fashion items or listening to that music because they had Marxist perspectives. That's more to do with the researchers themselves. So maybe these sociologists here have overestimated the extent to which young people participate in subcultures that specifically rebel against the bourgeoisie. Maybe they just like the clothing. Maybe they just like the music. And then Muggleton, a post-subculturalist, he argues that class is no longer significant in defining our culture. There's no need to study how the working class react to society differently to the middle class. Feminist views. So McRobbie and Garber, bedroom culture. Girls participate in gossiping about boys, reading magazines, listening to teeny bopper pop music, that kind of thing. Their own culture in their room, and then you could link that potentially to an element of social control as well, that girls are kind of restricted by patriarchy, if you think it's relevant to the question, or it could be a more positive example of how girls experience it. Also, there's been a bit of a shift in girls' magazines. So rather than focusing on like the housewife role of the future, there's more evidence that feminism has become more embedded in youth culture for girls. So focusing on like being successful in terms of their career, growing in confidence, and that kind of thing. Hay talks about hyperfemininity and compulsory heterosexuality. So this idea that in friendship groups that are all female, they still kind of police each other based on patriarchal standards. So there's still this sense that girls have to meet the requirements for females within a patriarchal society, and that the girls that they admire are often the ones that most closely match the patriarchal ideals for women. And then evaluation. There's more deviance happening, so obviously that directly sort of criticises bedroom culture. If girls are increasingly participating in gangs, then it's naive to suggest that they're at home in their bedrooms reading pop magazines. This idea of girls' sexuality being policed, so they're not as liberated as recent studies have suggested they are. Ladette culture, so they're no longer kind of conforming to this patriarchal definition of what girls should be. And then Muggleton, gender less significant, girls don't respond to societal pressures differently to boys now. So lots of different ways to go with that one. Postmodernism. So postmodernists are arguing that youth culture has become much more fluid, identities become much more hybrid, and they're moving away from feeling there's a need to study subcultures because they don't believe class, gender and ethnicity play a significant role anymore. So there's not distinct ways of experiencing culture because of those factors. And then also this idea of a collective group is less significant now because culture's become so fragmented that there isn't these collective groups that people are joining to identify as a group anymore. People have become much more individualized in their style, in their likes, breaks, in their leisure activities, etc. So people don't really form youth subcultures, but also a collective youth culture doesn't really exist either. So this is anything to do with the fragmentation or fluidity, hybridity of youth sub or culture. So Maffesoli refers to neo-tribe. So this is a new type of subculture. It's a replacement, and it's saying that the groups are much more loosely defined than subcultures are. And it's the idea that you don't have to be a member of one specific group. You can be associated with lots of different ones. And the groups are no longer defined by being part of it because you're working class or because you're female. It's more to do with like political interests such as anti-globalization or vegan movements, etc. And you can be affiliated with more than one tribe at the same time. Polymus is talking about the supermarket of style. So this is the idea that you can pick a mixture identity, you can select from lots of different styles, and therefore this idea of traditional subcultures having a collective style that everybody subscribes to doesn't really exist. And I don't know why this example is there because I don't really like it. It's not wrong, so you can use it, but a better thing to say would be like commitment to style is less common. Individuals may select some punk influences and some gothic influences in their individual style, but they don't exclusively subscribe to one specific subculture. So your fashion is influenced by lots of different groups. So you can use the example of punks and goths, but you don't dress like a goth every single day, and all of your friends don't have to be goths, if that makes sense. So you're selecting influences from different subcultures, but you don't have to be exclusive in that, and it isn't part of your collective group identity. You're kind of mixing and combining a range of different styles, and that doesn't characterize your friendship groups. So that's why it's still relevant to the youth sub, because you need to make it clear, like, why is it relevant to like this idea of youth as a collective rather than individual identity. And you're saying that the individual puts their own individual style first rather than thinking of it as something that's a collective experience where you're joining with a group identity. Muggleton, so post-subculturalist, these factors no longer define our culture or our experiences. There's no need to study these things anymore, and these things don't really exist. They're divides that previously defined how we experienced adolescence aren't as significant. So we now make our own choices, we purchase our own products, that kind of thing, and make our own individual decisions. So youth as a stage of life has become much more individualized rather than a sort of collective group experience determined by one's social characteristics. And then you can use these sorts of points here to to say that there is still there is still a significant defining factor. Sorry, dog's going mad. Defining your experiences. So ethnicity, gender, class are significant. They do influence people's style. They do influence how people experience that life stage. Okay, so the next one is participation. So again, this is talking about the non-deviant elements. So we don't want to just, assume that all young people are deviant. So for social class, we've got Ingram saying that working class boys, it's kind of part of their habitus to have a sense of strong kinship ties. So based on their local communities, based on their extended family, they want to feel a sense of cohesion and social solidarity. So they form networks based on that. Archer talks about how young people gain symbolic capital. So symbolic capital is like status that you get through visible indicators of your wealth. So young people try and demonstrate that they have higher levels of status by wearing brands, and then the difference is quite stark between what the working class and what the middle class consider to be status symbols. And then obviously you can use Nike or whatever for the working class. Smith and King are talking more about the middle class, and they refer to the Jack Wills crowd. So their norms and values include things like going to elite private schools, holidays, going to ski trips, the different clothing that they wear is obviously different to the working class. So things like Jack Wills. For evaluation, because you're putting me off. Evaluation is Muggleton, so the idea that class is no longer significant, obviously. Laurie, so consumer culture, the idea that all different social class groups can access the different brands now, so therefore there's not a clear distinction between the different social class groups based on that. And then Skeggs is talking about disidentification with the working class identity. So a sense of shame rather than pride in being working class. So that would go more directly against Ingram. For gender, so Kimmel works for both males and females. So just the idea that they conform to traditional notions of passive femininity and hegemonic masculinity. And then obviously in a 24 mark you could need 3 paragraphs just on traditional masculinity, or 3 just on femininity. So McRobbie and Hay are for femininity, and then Frosch and Kimmel for masculinity. So McRobbie talks about bedroom culture. So we've already talked about that one, easy peasy. And then Hay, we've already talked about that. So hyperfemininity as well. And then also she does bring in the class element. So middle class girls have more capacity to achieve higher levels of symbolic capital because they have the money to do that. Frosch refers to sport being a key part of hegemonic masculinity and kind of highly significant within male subcultures. And then Kimmel talking about living in Guyland, so the kind of defining aspects of masculinity. But when you're talking about this, try and not make it sound deviant. So it's not really referring to like toxic masculinity as such. It's more about so maybe focus more on this idea of like sports, video games, that kind of thing, so not in a deviant way. And then these points here are challenging the notion that subcultures exist to promote or perpetuate traditional ideals of masculinity and femininity. So Mac and Gale are talking about pro-school subcultures, and that boys very much do focus on their education and don't see it as something feminine and focus on sport, etc. They're actually very focused on achieving in the traditional academic sense. Simpson can be used to say how male subcultures have evolved to be more metrosexual, and men are much more focused on their appearance, fashion, etc. Jackson talking about the changes in female subcultures, so girls are becoming more laddish in their behaviours, there's less social control exercised over girls. and they're moving away or actively rebelling against passive femininity. Black men, so this idea of the new wave girls and assertive femininity, so girls are actively challenging sexism and becoming more feminist in their values and more visible around the school. Girl power sort of situation is happening within youth culture. And then Muggleton, again, gender's less significant. There's no need to study how males and females respond differently to subcultures. You could also bring in like gender fluidity as well in that point, so saying that gender's become much more fluid, so therefore these kind of binary subcultures are less relevant. Okay, ethnicity, so anything on traditional ethnic identities, Sewell is the essential point to include, and Sewell is specific to all ethnic groups. Sorry, is not specific to any ethnic group. You can use it more generally. So cultural comfort zones, people feel more comfortable sharing their culture with those more similar to them. It helps strengthen their ethnic identity, and this is a more positive thing. He's not saying that this is negative. If you wanted to say it was a response to racism, if you kind of needed to make it sound more negative, you could do, but actually he's saying it in a more positive way, that it's just that they have more in common, they can share their kind of traditions and cultural similarities with each other. Joe Howe talking about British Asians adopting a hyper-ethnic style, so they felt a sense of empowerment through being different, so they exaggerated their traditions, so in terms of the dress, the music they listened to, other sort of cultural activities would be exaggerated and amplified to celebrate their traditional culture, and that's what made them different. So they wanted to hold on to that rather than assimilate. Alexander talks about the importance of being black within black subcultures. So they had to take on stereotypical behaviour to be accepted. So you might refer to maybe like the music that they would listen to. So maybe like hip hop, R&B kind of music to be more accepted within their group, as that's something that's viewed more stereotypically associated with their culture. Mirza, so talking about, so this was research done in Brixton on young black females at school and how they were forming pro-school subcultures because it was part of their culture to have very high aspirations and had lots of female role models that were successful, and they wanted to be confident in themselves and in their future, and they were very motivated to get high grades at school. And then white, so this idea of increasing immigration resulted in white people being more exclusive in their subcultures because they reverted to wanting to be more British to protect their traditional British values that they felt were going to be eroded if they didn't kind of celebrate their Britishness within their groups. And then hybrid identities. So this would be anything to suggest that traditional ethnic identities were sort of in decline. They were less significant in terms of forming subcultures that were based on those kind of ethnic traditions. So hybrid identities, you can use Cashmore, so gangster rap, so basically saying that different geographical areas where black people originate from had different types of music, but then rap music has been something that has united black people collectively, so regardless of their geographical origin, it's something that's kind of homogenized within the culture. So the point is it's more hybrid because it's not one specific location. There's Caribbean influences, African American influences, etc. And therefore it's hybrid because it's created something new that people from different cultural backgrounds are listening to. And then also you can use NIAC, so white wannabes, so white people who are taking on characteristics and cultural influences because they want to be black. So it's hybrid because it's not traditionally their ethnic identity. Their ethnic identity doesn't align with their race. So therefore, it's the idea of white wannabes. It's not traditional. Back talking about neighbourhood nationalism. So the idea of locality supersedes the idea of ethnic background. So people feel a sense of common identity, sense of solidarity with people from their local area. But then you could argue that often neighbourhoods do tend to have an ethnic demographic that's more kind of common in that area, so wouldn't actually override the idea of cultural comfort zones. And then polymers, so this idea of picking, mixing identities. So people may choose to celebrate their traditional identity, but they also might take on elements of different cultures as well. So therefore, you don't have to necessarily be in a friendship group just with people from your traditional ethnic identity, because you can celebrate it with some people, but then take on elements of or popular culture or Britishness, etc. Types of subcultures. So there are 3 types of deviant subcultures, and for each one you need to know the definition, you need to know why people join them, and the key characteristics, and also examples. So delinquent, so norms and values involve non-utilitarian, so nothing to do with money and petty crimes. Cohen argues that working class boys form this type of subculture to escape from the status frustration they experience. So they lack status in society and they're frustrated by their low position and they would like to gain status in new ways. So it's a functionalist point because there's consensus amongst members of society that they want to achieve status. But this group, Cohen argues, are culturally deprived, so their kind of experience is characterised by educational underachievement, and then they couldn't find new ways to gain recognition in the traditional way. So they had to create new norms and values that didn't kind of traditionally exist. So things like bunking school or vandalism, that kind of thing, would gain them status that they can't gain in a more legitimate way. Miller argues that the whole of the working class have a wider sort of lower class subculture, and that's characterised by these focal concerns. So just learn a couple of those and say that essentially the working class gain status, particularly males, through following those norms and values. And then Parker, so working class young males in Liverpool, argued that they were more fatalistic, high levels of unemployment, so they had to find new ways to gain a sense of fulfillment and a sense of kind of identity or status that they couldn't get through work because they were unemployed. So it was things like binge drinking and sexual conquests. Criminal subcultures, so hierarchical in their structure, characterised by utilitarian criminal activity. In terms of what the two characteristics are, you could say non-utilitarian crime, and you could say like what working class, or you could say like educational underachievement, fatalistic values, lots of different things you could say. For this one, I'd say the two key things are that they function to achieve financial gain, and the second one you could say is the hierarchical structure. So Cloward and Olin talk about the illegitimate opportunity structure. So again, this is a functionalist perspective, and it's saying that individuals in society all subscribe to the same goals, so we all want the same success in terms of financial success. And then if you can't achieve it in a legitimate way, you turn to alternative means. So in this case, they're joining criminal subcultures, so usually things like drug dealing to make money. Venkatesh, so specific example of the Black Kings, criminal opportunity structure to operate in the same way that a business would, so you can gain promotions to move up the hierarchy and gain more profit. Densley argues that new types of criminal subcultures are emerging, and these are essentially gangs, which you can then refer to in the gang section. So there's now an expansion of drug networks, and they're operating on what we call the global scale. So the idea that it's the local scale that's expanded, so we call it like global. And the reason is because within London, or within cities, the drug prices are very expensive. Are very cheap, because there's so much competition, so you have to sell drugs at a cheaper price or no one would buy your drugs. But if you expand out on the county lines, then they could sell the drugs for more money because there's less people selling drugs in those areas. So they kind of expanded their networks and are more organised in their approach to drug selling. So rather than it being like quite a local area that you were just sort of doing it, it's more organised and business-like in their model. Spectacular subcultures. So the key thing here, when it's saying like they're highly visible and flamboyant, is to do with their fashion. So a key feature of spectacular subculture is they use fashion to highlight their views. So one example is the punks. So they were wearing so brightly coloured hair, offensive t-shirts, tattoos, piercings, and they were particularly opposing right-wing governments, the idea of capitalism, kind of corporate control, mass culture, that sort of thing. So they were opposing those things, and they use their music and their fashion to demonstrate their rebellion against them. Clark, so looking at the skinheads, so they were resisting the changes that were happening in society as a result of immigration, and the capitalist regime had sort of constructed this narrative that immigrants were moving to the UK and the jobs that they were employed in. So it's hard to say this without being able to do it in inverted commas. Basically, the bourgeoisie constructed a narrative to distract white people away from challenging the government, and they needed to scapegoat another group. So the group that they scapegoated were ethnic minorities, and they blamed them essentially for the unemployment rates amongst white people. But obviously this was a false narrative that had been created. The real situation was that there wasn't enough skills amongst the white working class that were relevant to the job market at the time, and immigration was actively encouraged to ensure that we had the skilled workers coming from other countries to fill those jobs. But the bourgeoisie needed a scapegoat, and they didn't want people to target them and advocate a communist revolution. But essentially, the white working class felt that they needed to create a culture, a subculture, which preserved their traditional identity, their traditional community. So they became highly racist. They got involved with football hooliganism because that was a way of demonstrating their masculinity, which they'd lost through their unemployment. So another key feature here is the sense of like political agenda, which is like a commonality between those. Another set of spectacular subcultures are the mods and rockers. So the mods were the ones that were more stylish, wore more smart clothes, they rode scooters, they were more kind of well educated, philosophical, listened to jazz music. The mods were middle class, and the rockers were working class. So rock music, obviously, the kind of leather studded boots, rode motorbikes, leather jackets. And again, so you can use them as an example of fashion. The reason people joined these two subcultures was there was, in the post-war period, there became like a emergence of adolescence existing as its own kind of distinct period of life. So prior to the war, you basically went through childhood and then into adulthood immediately. But once the Education Reform Act made education compulsory for longer, young people had this kind of time where they experienced youth. As the media became more prevalent, it allowed for sort of fashion trends to develop. Music was more marketed, that kind of thing. So that's why this existed as kind of subcultures, and then the media portrayed the groups as rivals, and then that made more people sort of want to join one of the groups because you felt like it was a rivalry and you had to be one or the other. Anti-school subcultures, so pupils who rebel against the school and obviously create a set of delinquent norms and values that oppose the actual aims of school. So one example is the lads. So Paul Willis talks about working class boys who could see through the myth of meritocracy. So they could see that the capitalist system was actively working against them. So they joined these subcultures in order to because they just thought the system was rigged against them. So sorry, I'm just getting my charger. So they saw the capitalist system was rigged against them. So they just thought there's no point us obeying our teachers and listening to the rules of the school because we're never going to be successful. And then obviously that did result in them failing anyway. So despite their class consciousness, they still failed in education and ended up in a working class job. But at least they didn't have to kind of go through the system with a complicit attitude. So they felt a sense of like achievement in their rebellion. Hargreaves, so labelling. Obviously, usually this is to do with social class, but you could refer to class, gender, or ethnicity, and the pupils' experience of self-fulfilling prophecy. You can talk about that quite easily. Lacey, so pupils who are placed in lower streams tend to form anti-school subcultures because they feel that they've been branded failures, become demotivated, the teachers have lower expectations of them, and that results in self-fulfilling prophecy. In opposition to the middle class, who are more likely to be placed in the higher streams or sets, and the teachers have higher expectations of them. Lastly, we've got gangs. So A group who identify as a collective, usually in rivalry with others over territory, um, reputation in terms of violence, customers in terms of drug selling. So you can use criminal subcultures as examples here as well, because they are very similar. The key thing to think about gangs is there's a bit of a debate within the studies as to whether people are joining gangs for a sense of collective identity, for a sense of solidarity, for status, which is slightly different, or literally for financial utilitarian means. So Decker is kind of in the mid. No, he's not. Sorry. Decker's basically saying that it's mainly to do with territory, violence, identity, group. Group identity, a sense of belonging. Hardin is saying that it's all about status, validation, respect, and then obviously use a street capital as a way that you might do that. So street capital can be things like you would have higher levels of it if you had won more fights, if you wore certain clothing, that kind of thing. So it could be, similar to symbolic capital in terms of like the brands that you wear, but also, or jewelry or whatever, watches that you might have, but also it can be things to do with like violence and those sorts of accolades. Densley is saying that they're becoming much more organised in their structure, moving towards a greater sense of being a criminal subculture. And he argues that gangs go through an evolutionary process. So they start out as more sort of delinquent subcultures where they're just being violent to be expressive, so for status, but then ultimately it becomes instrumental, which means it's for like a financial gain. So there's like a monetary motive behind it. And then, refers to the hierarchical structure. So, and also the key thing to think about gangs is they're the newest type of subculture. So if you get a question asking about whether subcultures have changed, whether these traditional types still exist, the traditional types, the first four, and then you could argue that particularly spectacular cultures have died out. The other ones haven't really. Criminal subcultures definitely haven't. Anti-school subcultures definitely haven't. Delinquent subcultures. You could argue that now the unemployment rate is decreasing, that kind of thing. There's less of this in our society. But the key is that gangs is the newest type of subculture. Evaluation for all types. So if you get a question, I mean, the more common kind of question on this would be debating like why people join subcultures, and then you could use like the different types against each other. So if it was like, are they joining for financial reasons, then you would use like criminal subcultures and maybe some elements of the gangs against things like anti-school subcultures and delinquent, because they're obviously saying that you would join for more status reasons or whatever. But these are the studies you can use otherwise. So McRobbie's saying that these explanations are very male focused. They don't really offer an explanation as to why girls form deviant subcultures and what their role is within those. Mathesoli, types of subcultures don't really exist in such a distinct way anymore. Polymus, this idea again that people are much more individual in the style that they choose and subscribe to, rather than such a strong definition of a collective group. And Abrams is saying that young people experience youth in a homogenous way rather than it being so varied and fragmented as the studies here have suggested. Why does that one keep popping up? I've done that one. Number 4. Okay, so functionalist. So Merton's just mentioned here because it's something that you did at GCSE, so it just helps you understand what Cloud and Olin were saying. But Merton was talking about individuals, so therefore he's not actually relevant to this unit. So he was there just to help you understand like how this emerged as a separate area of study, but don't refer to Merton. So subcultural theories. So functionalism is obviously a consensus approach. So the reason it's a consensus approach is, firstly, all members of society want to achieve success. So we're all socialised into the same success values. Some people can't achieve them due to their social position, structural theory. The structure of society can limit certain people. So they form subcultures to gain status in new ways. And then obviously they can be arguing that that is, in a meritocratic society, those who have been culturally deprived and don't necessarily achieve a higher social position as a result of their lack of work ethic or their talents. That's why they're limited by their social position. So he's not necessarily saying that it's unfair, it's just saying that that's the case. But then also this is saying that if the majority of society subscribe to one set of norms and values and conform to those, and then there's a minority that don't, then they, by definition, become deviant, because deviance is when you break the norms and values. So in order for deviance to exist, there has to be a consensus, because to define something as breaking the norms and values, there has to be a collective set of norms and values that most people are conforming to in order for it to exist. So just be kind of aware of these reasons, because there could be a very specific question that's phrased in this way, or like phrased to do with consensus, that is alluding to the fact you need to talk about functionalism without actually saying functionalism. So make sure you understand what these two things mean, because they could be used in the phrasing of the question for you to then realise that it wants you to talk about these studies. So Cohen is a functionalist, obviously. Status frustration, the key ideas being that people conform to the success values, they can't achieve them, so they need new ways of gaining status. And the success goals aren't financial, they're literally like, I want a sense of status, I want a sense of validation. So they do criminal acts to gain status by their peers. Cloud and Olin. So the illegitimate opportunity structure exists. If people can't succeed in the legitimate way of getting a good job, etc., then they will turn to, or they can turn to, alternative means such as drug dealing, which is obviously an illegal method, an illegitimate method of achieving success. That would be enough to talk about, but you've got these as well. So if they fail to form a criminal subculture, they may join a conflict subculture, which is more to do with gaining respect through violence rather than financial benefits. And retreater subcultures are those that are double failures, so they fail to join a criminal and a conflict subculture, so the ultimate rejection. Nightingale. So specifically talking, so very similar idea to Cloud and Olin about this idea of there's a clear route to success, but he is talking about those who experience the barriers of racism and poverty, so like a double barrier, are more likely to turn to crime because of the limitations on their success routes. Evaluation, so you can use Matza, or you could use even like Eisenstadt to say that they're over predicting delinquency. It's more of a temporary thing rather than it being so significant levels of deviance and it being a lifelong path. McRobbie, Ismail Stream doesn't explain the female experience. That's a bit of a tricky one to explain. So you could say that there isn't consensus in society. There isn't like one set of norms and values that everyone is subscribing to. Some people kind of disagree with the values that the bourgeoisie have put forward and actively rebel against those rather than finding alternative ways to meet those goals. The New Right, so Sewell's triple quandary theory, obviously think about your time management here and don't talk about all three in detail. You can just list the three and maybe talk about the top one in more detail to make it more concise. Definitely would say the top one's the easiest one to explain, and the third one I wouldn't go into detail on because that's very similar to what Dennis is saying. So Sewell, he argues that Black Caribbean boys are more vulnerable to joining deviant subcultures because of these risk factors. So rejection from white society, conspicuous consumption, lack of male role model, and in order to kind of compensate from the rejection that they've faced at several stages of their lives from fathers, education system, white society, they're more likely to kind of exert their machoism and hypermasculine identity. Murray, so poor socialisation, so he argues that the underclass are less capable of socialising their children, specifically refers to lone parent families in this, and his belief is that they teach their children to be fatalistic and immediate gratification, and therefore their future often ends in being on welfare benefits and finding a sense of like reward through deviant activities rather than the kind of more traditional ways of receiving rewards in society. Dennis, so he argues that lone parent families, specifically lone mothers, are less able to control their children and exercise discipline over them than nuclear families, and he argues that that can often lead to them joining anti-school subcultures because their norms and values are less aligned with that of teachers and the school. Again, disclaimer, I don't agree with this, I'm just telling you what Dennis said. Evaluation. Mackingale, so Mackingale actively disputes this argument, saying that black boys from disadvantaged backgrounds are often part of pro-school subcultures, work very hard at school and have the same success values. Abrams argues that there's not really a distinction between youth experiences for the working class or for different ethnic groups, so therefore it's an exaggeration to say that these specific groups experience it differently. Cloud and Olin specifically criticised this idea of there being different norms and values and this idea of fatalism, because he's saying that there are barriers in place and or you could use Nightingale as well actually to say this, there are barriers in place and they're finding new ways to achieve success. So he's not justifying their behaviour and saying that it's acceptable, but he's saying that they're not fatalistic, they're not just sitting there accepting their fate, they're trying to find new ways to be successful. Marxists, so Horn and Jefferson is the same point as before, so just the idea that young people use their music and fashions to resist against hegemony, and the whole purpose of it is to rebel against the capitalist system. So the function that youth subcultures play is young people to find a way to channel their anger against capitalism and demonstrate their left-wing views. Clark, already talked about this one again, so the idea is it benefits capitalism because it specifically scapegoated another group and allowed the working class to form a subculture that was based around racism rather than targeting their dissatisfaction with their unemployment, etc., at the bourgeoisie, whose actual fault it was. Gilroy, talks about institutional racism in society and injustices in society being challenged through crime. So people who are oppressed in society and angry at the exploitative nature of the system, that can lead to them committing crimes as a sort of political act against the system. And then the London riots is quite a good example of that. Evaluation. So this idea of researcher bias, were these, particularly this one, so were the punks, were they actually Marxists, or did they just like the music? Did they just want to wear the clothing? Did everyone who wore the Sex Pistols t-shirt actually have anti-corporate views, etc.? Also the Gilroy point, like, did people get involved in the London riots because they wanted to uprise against the government, or did they just want to steal a new TV? Muggleton, so specifically focusing on class here, young people from different social class backgrounds don't experience youth culture differently. Again, McRobbie, why is it always talking about boys and not how girls experience it? Interactionism. So Becker talks about labelling and specifically refers to moral entrepreneurs, so members of agencies of social control, and how they have the capacity to label others because they're viewed in society as kind of the morally superior in terms of being role models in society. If they attach a label to somebody, it can become their master status, so the main way that they're seen, and then this can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then more deviant acts follow. Cicerel, typifications, so this is the idea of like offender profiling. People who fit the typifications are more likely to be stopped and searched. You could use statistics to support that, so black men 8 times more likely. Young, so this was the idea of the amplification of deviance, so more deviance happened. The drug takers were kind of peripherally, casually taking lower class drugs initially, but then as a result of how the agencies of social control intervened, they ended up seeing drug use as a central activity and part of their identity, and they were using kind of harder drugs more frequently as a result. Evaluation. So Downs and Rock, too deterministic, self-negating prophecy, people can reject the labels. Murray, so Murray obviously would say here that it's not a result of the police targeting a specific group, it's actually that this group are more likely to be deviant, according to Murray. So it's not a result of labelling, it's not a result of unfair treatment, it's a difference in norms and values. Rena provides a positive evaluation. So he argues the police do label certain groups, and then this leads to more tension and backlash. Also, Gilroy provides support for that as well in the arguments he said. Okay, so this one is about deviant patterns and trends. So you have to learn these statistics. So make sure you do learn the statistics, and also have an awareness of what the traditional patterns are and what the new patterns are. So the traditional pattern here would be that working class are more deviant, and then the change, you could argue, is middle class are becoming more deviant, or you could argue that they always have been deviant, but it's just their criminal or deviant activity is more in the dark figure. It's not that recorded, reported, detected. It's not that researched within sociology. So all of these people you can use to say that the working class are deviant. Another study that you've got, and you can use this for ethnicity as well. So Preston talks about British chavs saying that their culture is sort of characterised by cultural deprivation, that they don't value education, often participate in antisocial behaviour, anti-school subcultures as well, and specific references to poor taste in their fashion, and sociologists have debated whether this can apply to the whole white working class. And then these two studies here are middle class, and then also Stanley Cohen, the mods are also middle class. So if you get asked about an example of a middle class deviant subculture, you've got the mods, you've got the Bullingdon Club, and you've got punk bohemians. So Kingsley is talking about the Bullingdon Club, Oxford University. So elite group who are deviant because they're sexist, drunken, disorderly behaviour, trashing public restaurants, drink driving, speeding, etc. Frith refers to punk bohemians. So the traditional perspective is that the punks is a working class movement. So it was there to rebel against capitalism, but actually most punks or the movement originated within the middle class. So middle class obviously can still rebel against the bourgeoisie if we think of it as the class is more fragmented than just bourgeoisie and proletariat. The middle class are obviously proletariat. They are the originators of the movement, so they created the symbols within the art schools. They're the ones that are more educated, so have a greater understanding of Marxist theory, would understand the political intricacies of the movement. They would have a greater class consciousness, understanding of left-wing politics, that kind of thing. So it's the idea that it's the punk movement wasn't actually working class, it was more middle class. So these are points to say that middle class were more involved. Ethnicity, so again, learn the statistics. Obviously, historically, so this is kind of like a newer trend. So the idea that white working class boys now the lowest achieving, so the white underachievement is a more recent thing. Obviously, it could be to do with things like the manual jobs for white boys. White working class boys tend to be in decline, that kind of thing. So that could be part of the reason. Obviously, the chav phenomenon is fairly of a more recent cultural change, that sort of thing. So you could argue that the sort of increase in deviance amongst white working class boys is more recent. So Brown you can use as well in a question if it was talking about whether spectacular subcultures still exist, whether the skinhead movement has died out or whether there's been a resurgence, and this is talking about neo-Nazism, so the idea that this far-right extreme movement still very much exists and is increasing in our society, concerningly. Gilbourne, Black Caribbean boys labelled at school leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then Jacobson, rejection from white society can cause retreatism into their own subculture and also makes the group more vulnerable to radicalisation. So studies traditionally talk about boys and male deviance, but you can argue that their patterns are changing and girls are getting much more involved in deviance, and female deviance has been studied more. So we've got Mackingale talking about the macho lads is what he calls them. So the macho lads, and he talks about the 3 Fs, which are kind of the fundamental values that they aim to achieve. Sewell also talks about machoism, so hypermasculinity. All of those things are ways of gaining status to cope with the racism and rejection that they've experienced. And then these 3 studies here are all talking about females and how their deviance is increasing. So we've got Klein explaining that girls are more involved in gangs now, but then also that within the gangs there is still a patriarchal hierarchy within the gangs. So females are still subjected to sexual exploitation within the gang, but it's still an example of female deviance. Ladette culture, girls are taking on traits that are traditionally associated with masculinity. Also, this is an example of a delinquent subculture, an anti-school subculture, and results in educational underachievement because they're preoccupied with drinking, fighting, etc. Archer, so this one is about hypersexuality. So this is different to hyperfemininity because it's rebelling against traditional notions of femininity. There's being exaggerated and overt in their sexuality, which is obviously contradicting to passive femininity. And you can say like they're rebelling against the school dress codes because they're wearing short skirts, fake eyelashes, etc. So depending on the question, these evaluation points could apply, or the points might be more relevant from the topic 2 pack, where you're just saying that these groups are not actually deviant. So find the studies that say that these groups aren't deviant instead. And then last one. So here, you're just explaining what the role is of the media and how it's kind of led to an increase in deviance. So there's lots of different examples and you can use most of them for most points. So if the question's folk devils, just make sure you're specifically focusing on these 3 elements and how the group has been symbolised, how their actions have been exaggerated, and how further immoral actions have been predicted for the group that you're talking about. If it's about moral panic, you can use these for moral panic, but you just need to focus on what was the societal reaction, what did they demand that the government did. If it's about amplification of deviance, why did that cause more deviance to happen? So anything in this pack would be relevant. So if anything comes up about folk devils, moral panics, deviance, amplification, you can literally use anything in the pack, but just make sure that you're linking it to the specific requirements of the question based on what the definition is of the keyword that's in the question. So folk devils are like a negative representation of a social group, and they're stigmatized, so they're portrayed in a negative way. They remind the rest of society how we shouldn't act. And one example, the most famous example that Cohen put forward, are the Mods and Rockers. So they were stigmatized, they were viewed as delinquent, as dangerous, as having this kind of rivalry that was very much fabricated. And then if you get a question where you have to explain an example of a folk devil, say how they're symbolised. So in this case, they were symbolised by the motorbikes or cycles that they rode. Exaggeration, it was they kind of fabricated this rivalry between the groups, or exaggerated the extent to which there was a rivalry, and then they predicted further. Sorry. The dog's just been crazy. They predicted further clashes between the groups in the future. More recent examples. So New Age and Folk Devil. And then obviously if you're going to talk about these groups, think about how are they symbolised, what's the exaggeration, what's the prediction about their future behaviour. So the New Age and Folk Devil been associated with obviously terrorism. Forbert talking about hoodies, so young people been associated with deviance, antisocial behaviour because of the visible symbol of the hoodie, exaggerating like how much they were involved in different deviant activities, predicting that they would start to be more criminal in their behaviours in the future. And then if you were linking this, for example, to amplification of deviance, you would be saying that like more young people started to wear hoodies in the future because of it. If you were linking it to moral panic, you would say members of society were increasingly concerned about hoodies and demanded that the police and the government acted, so therefore the government chose to ban them from shopping centres, etc. Moral panics. So moral panic is defined as the public being concerned about an issue and they're demanding that the government or the the agencies of social control act to control the issue. And then obviously the case of the Mods and Rockers, they demanded more police presence at the events they were likely to be at, and more arrests should take place. This here is about moral panics being created by the bourgeoisie in order to protect the interests of capitalism. So in the 1970s, there was a crisis of hegemony. So that means that members of the proletariat started to gain a class consciousness and saw the cracks or the flaws in the capitalist system. So there were high levels of unemployment, economic recession, that kind of thing, inflation. So members of the proletariat were challenging the government and they were questioning whether capitalism was the best economic infrastructure for our society. So the bourgeoisie needed to construct a false narrative. They needed a diversion strategy and they needed a group to scapegoat. And what they did in order to protect their interests and to maintain the success of the kind of capitalist ideology that they were trying to brainwash society into is they implemented a divide and rule strategy. So they were dividing the working class into the black and white working class so they could rule them all. So the false media coverage was about black youths as muggers. So they presented young black males as being like a threat to the white working class, saying that they were more likely to be criminal and that people were unsafe. So they were presented as folk devils, and the members of society fell for the false narrative. Their attention was redirected away from the government and the problems that the government were causing for society, and it caused greater tension between the different ethnic groups within the working class. So the moral panic served an ideological function because it protected capitalism. It made sure that people were distracted and not challenging the capitalist system. They weren't advocating a communist revolution because they were too busy or preoccupied with their racist views. And then Young, we've already talked about this one. So Moral panic. So members of society were being hostile towards the hippies, demanding more arrests, demanding more police presence to curb the drug habits and social behaviour of the hippies. But actually all this did was led to greater rivalry between hippies and the rest of society, and eventually they just started committing more and more crime. So it became a central part of their identity, led to a self-fulfilling prophecy where they started committing more crimes because it had become like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and who they were a central part of their identity. Deviancy amplification spiral. So obviously you can use Jung, you can use any of the previous studies. Wilkins is more just the definition, to be honest. If you're using Wilkins, you need an example. That's just there to tell you what it actually is. So that was more for when you were in year 12, just to give you the definition. But if you're using that as a paragraph, you need an example. So you might use the example of Thorburn hoodies and then say that more and more young people started to wear hoodies as a result of how the news reported on it. Murphy, so media encouragement of football hooliganism, so the glorification of violence, kind of this idea that they were making you compete, making different football teams compete to be the most like notorious group of hooligans. They were like scaremongering the public by saying that people were taking razors or knives to football games. So then the other teams started to kind of be more violent against the others because they were more ready for a fight than they would have been if the media had kind of stayed out of it. So the media caused more deviance to happen because they were like riling up opposing teams, and they were reporting on which teams were the biggest threat, and also glorifying like arrests and violence. And then last thing, these key points here, evaluation points, are important. In the other booklets, the evaluation points, you can almost just like pull stuff from other parts of the booklet, whereas these are essential. You need to learn these. So these 3 points are basically saying that the media doesn't play a hugely significant role in creating deviance. So the first point is McRobbie and Thornton are saying that folk devils are no longer as marginalised as they previously were. So firstly, because the kind of interactive nature of how media works now, so platforms not just being controlled by the sort of media moguls and the kind of traditional media platforms, so things like the BBC, it's now much more interactive, so Twitter, TikTok, whatever else. So people can use the platforms to call out or to challenge the representation of those groups. So if you think about the black mugging example of moral panic, you could argue that now the media is more pluralistic, and there's lots of different ways that the media is communicated to us. So people can present a more positive narrative through like the Black Lives Matter movement and that kind of thing. So the idea that the onus goes back onto the capitalist system rather than the group that they were trying to scapegoat. Secondly, it's just much more fast-paced now, so you're not going to have kind of repeated stories about the same group in the media. So if you try to represent the Mods and the Rockers as a folk devil now, the likelihood of that developing into a moral panic is much lower because there's much more frequent and variety of news stories. So essentially, it's hard to create a folk devil now. The media has kind of changed in its structure and pace, so that doesn't happen as much. Kitzinger, essentially, we're not passive, we're not stupid, we don't just believe everything we see in the media, we don't accept the media narratives and how they present people. So you can refer to this idea of like fake news. We don't believe everything that we see. We don't accept and sort of just create new perceptions of others based on that, what the media says about them. And then Durkheim is saying that the media is actively an agency of social control that reduces crime. So degradation ceremonies, the media publicly humiliates people that commit crime, and that discourages us from doing so. So if we see someone get arrested at a football game, we don't think, oh, I'm going to go and do that as well. We think, oh, I better not take a knife, or I better not get involved in a fight because I will get arrested if I do so. So it's unlikely that we actually would experience an amplification of deviance because of the media coverage. It's more likely that that would deter criminals from committing crime in the future. Oh my god, I feel like that was a long video, but there you go.